I'm Roxanne Reddington-Wild. I'm from the Partnership of Historic Bostons, and this is a really great talk that Neil Wright will be doing, who's also from the partnership, but I'll do that formal intro in a few minutes. Um, the Partnership of Historic Bostons, as you likely know, we're a small, all-volunteer local history organization based in Boston, Massachusetts, and also Boston, England, and surrounds for both places. Donations from people like you are what keeps our excellent talks and other events, such as our walks, etc., going. We welcome donations, small and big. So consider that if you really enjoy what you're experiencing. Today's structure for the talk, we're starting a few minutes past 2 o'clock. We'll be going to about 3:30 or so. For the first hour or so, Neil Wright, our speaker, will be doing a slideshow. PowerPoint essentially is the new word for slideshow these days. And then a little bit after 3, I'm expecting, we'll then stop looking at the actual images. We'll go back to seeing all of us. And we'll do about 20 minutes or so of questions, and then we'll do a very brief wrap up where I'll tell you a tiny bit about our fall series that the partnership is doing too. So let me introduce Neil Wright. Neil's talk, as you know, is Boston, Lincolnshire, England, the prequel. Neil is a local history historian, a historian of local history, published all sorts of books on local history of England, of Lincolnshire. Neil himself was born and bred in Boston, Lincolnshire. And from 1962 to 2010, he was working in county government in Lincolnshire. Neil wrote in 1986, wrote the book of Boston. Has also written much more recently, Boston in 50 Buildings, because Neil, among other things, is chairman emeritus now for the Society of Lincolnshire History and Archaeology. I'm an archaeologist by background myself, and archaeology is the study of people through their material culture, such as buildings. And the Society for Lincolnshire History and Archaeology was founded in 1844. Neil's still very much a leading active member. Neil contributed to the recent book, Boston, the Small Town with a Big History. And his latest book is The History of the New Theatre Royal in Lincoln, which is the third building on that site to be used as a theater since the 1760s. So this is why we are delighted to have Neil both as a board member for the Partnership of Historic Bostons, which is an organization, as I said, originated to celebrate and share the history of Boston, England, and Boston, Massachusetts, and the connections. But we're extra delighted to have Neil giving this talk. When we were doing a run-through earlier this morning, Sarah and I had so many questions for the slides that we realized we just had to shut up because we'd never even finished, the run through of practicing like 2 or 3 slides. And you're going to have lots of questions too. So with that, let me unspotlight myself, have just Neil spotted, and we're going to go over to the presentation. Let me go with that. There we go. And over to you, Neil.
Right, well, thank you very much, Roxanne, for that introduction. I hope I can live up to it. Right, I think the essence to get into the talk, as Roxanne hinted, I'm going to give an overview really of the development between Boston and Boston. And there's so much more which I could add. So I hope that if there's anything that interests you, that you want to have further information, please put in a question, and then we'll have an extra couple of hours, I'm sure, at the end to answer those. Just to explain the introduction, the title. As everyone knows, Boston played an important part in the 1770s in establishing the independence of the United States, as it could summarize that briefly. But in the case of Boston and other places on the East Coast, you've got a prequel, previous stories for previous 150 years. And in relation to Boston, which is my particular interest, I'm going to look at that history, essentially concentrating on Why did Boston, Massachusetts get to be called Boston? Well, the answer is, first of all, let's go to the next slide, please. It's based on the
Yep.
next slide.
Hang on. Yeah, I know. Yep. Okay. Let's see if we can get to the next slide. Okay. Let me hop out of this. No, I've just lost. There we go.
Right, thank you.
Is that the next one? I think I went two ahead.
You've gone to it, that's right. That's the one, thank you. Well, essentially, it is Boston. Starting off from Boston is in Lincolnshire. It is named after the patron saint of the parish church, St. Botolph. So basically, Boston, Botolph's town. That's how it came to be. Boston was very important in the Middle Ages, became one of the most prosperous ports in the town. For 200 years, between 1100 and 1300, then went into decline. But it was from that period, from 1306 to about the next 250 years, it built this massive church, and then a massive church tower. The tower itself is the tallest of any parish church within England. Then you're moving quickly on from that was the establishment of the town. By the 17th century and the 1600s, Boston had become a Puritan town in the period from the Reformation up to 1630, very much became dominated by Puritans. There was a stronghold for that town. I'll say a little bit more about in a few moments about that. And summarize, jumping quickly to the end, what that resulted in was establishing such a Puritan community, which they then wanted to transfer to the New England when that was under threat. But I'll explain that sentence as we're going on. Right, next slide, please.
So sorry. There we go. Okay. I see how I do it.
Right, so as I say, that was an external view looking at it, and the picture is very much dominated by the tower. But if it wasn't, and that tends to distract from the fact that the church itself is one of the largest in England in actual space inside the building. And so this is a picture taken about the early 1800s to show the interior of the parish church, and it's so massive. In the 1600s, early 1600s, Boston had a population of roughly around about 5,000. And in fact, most of those 5,000, in theory, if they were all standing, could have got into this single building. It was large enough to take that total number. And so for that reason, nowadays we're used to towns having lots of churches. But in Boston at that period, there was just the one church, and it was large enough to serve all of the needs. Next slide, please. So to put Boston into location, there's three elements to this map here. The first map on the top left-hand side shows the whole of Great Britain, and Lincolnshire is about a third of the way from the bottom of that east coast. If you look at the map on the top right, there you're looking a little bit closer. You've got Lincolnshire and East Anglia, and Boston is towards the centre of the map. It's on the edge of a bay, which is called the Wash, and the area over to the right is the North Sea. So you've got England, Midlands extending to the west of Boston, East Anglia to the east, really a bit more distance because it's separated by the fens. If you look at the bottom element, this shows, in fact, Boston in a little bit more detail. It shows that it actually is 4 miles inland from the sea. And while this particular map shows the channel between Boston and the sea and the Wash as a straight line, that is something that happened in the 1880s. Before then, there was a very winding channel which went to, and that added to the difficulties which the port experienced because it was 4 miles inland. But the reason for it being 4 miles inland is exactly because, in fact, that was where the river crossed by the main road going east-west through that part of the county. Next slide, please. This is putting Boston into the context of the fens around the town. Fens in the Lincolnshire context are a very flat, low-lying land. That's flat, but in fact, there's almost no difference in height anywhere within that area. There are slight hills to the north, over on the right-hand side of the map, and over on the left-hand side, that particular area as well. But between that high land and the coast were the fens. There was another ridge of slightly higher land between the fens and the coastal marshes. When I say slightly higher, in that context, between the fens and the marshes, it was only about 6 feet higher. You know, when you're in an area as flat as the fens, a height of 6 feet is quite significant for avoiding flooding. Because if you're 6 feet higher and the floods are only 2 foot high, you're okay. But looking at this particular map, there are 3 fens to the north of Boston, all adjoining each other. Numbers 4, 5, and 6 as they are on the map. These were the East, West, and Wildmoor fens, and they covered a total of 40,000 acres together. To the west of Boston was Holland Fen, and that had about 22,000 acres. Those were the fens adjacent to Boston itself, but there are other parts of the fenland going north towards Lincoln itself. You can see that is marked as number 3 on the map. And then there was other fens that went southwards beyond the bottom of this particular map. The significance of this is that the fens being so flat, they were liable to flooding every year because as water came down, the rivers passed through the fens. The bed of the river was actually higher than the land on either side. It was slow going amongst as it flowed along, that in fact the silt of it was dropped in the bottom and the bed of the river was raised level. So it only kept from flooding by high land, by banks that only covered 2 or 3 feet high on each side. But every spring there would be more water coming down and that would spread over. So for that reason, nobody lived in the fens. They lived in the villages just to the north or onto the slightly higher land to the south, around the edges of the fens. So that they were very much a barrier, and that helped to make Boston, in many ways, isolated from the rest of the county, from the rest of the country. Next slide, please. This is looking at Boston in relation to parish boundaries, the administrative and religious boundaries. And so most of the map, the western half, sorry, the left-hand side of this map shows the Holland Fen part of it. But in the centre, towards the right, is Boston and Skirbeck, which goes around it. So you can see Boston with that red area in the centre. That was where the built-up streets of Boston were within in the 1630s, as well as at a later period. And the white area extending north of that and a little bit around the area, that is the parish and later the borough of Boston. That is that boundary. Boston was created in about, well, roughly 1086, when it was carved out of the larger parish of Skirbeck, so that Skirbeck extends round to the east, to the north, and to the south of Boston. And it had been carved out of that area and became a separate borough parish within its own. But it was very closely related to Skirbeck. Next slide, please. This shows what I was saying earlier about the winding channel between Boston and the Wash. It's a rather faint line, but in fact, about halfway down there, you've got the area which is the boundary of the Wash itself. But what this shows is that in the Wash, that was at low tide, that had lots of mud banks. And so even when the vessels came down the river and got into the Wash, they still had to follow a winding channel between mud banks at low tide. So this was rather much of a problem all of the time. But it meant that, in fact, vessels had difficulty getting up into the town because of the winding channel. The next slide, please. Yeah, this picture of 1799 illustrates, again, it's 200 years after the period we're talking about. But if you look at the centre of the panel, as you're looking at it on the left-hand side of the illustration, you can see that a boat is being hauled in by 2 rowing boats. Because the channel was so winding, it meant that if a vessel had tried to sail up, it would have been at one point have had the wind behind its sail, but then it would be sailing into the wind. And the river was so narrow, there was no space for it to tack about. So the only safe way, if it couldn't be hauled by a horse on the bank, it was much more, perhaps too heavy for a single animal. It could be actually be rowed in by rowers in individual boats and brought into the centre of the town. So the port was, as I say, the town is 4 miles north, and the port was right in the centre of the town. Next slide, please. This is the centre of Boston. Again, a picture of 1799, but very showing the situation as it was in the 17th century. So what we're looking at in the foreground is Packhouse Quay, which was the main quay within the port of Boston. And just behind it, you can see the vessel on the left-hand side. Behind that is the town bridge, the only bridge across the river in Boston. And in fact, the river with them had no more bridges until you got to Lincoln, which was about 30 or 40 miles away. So that it was quite a significant crossing point of the River Witham, and that was in many ways why Boston was located where it was, because the town was approached by the roads of the coastal villages converged on this particular point. And so that was why the town and then the port was established at this place, inland, not at a bit inland, rather than actually on the exact coast itself. And in this picture, you can also see the presence, the dominance of the parish, of the tower of the parish church just behind it. The buildings on the right in this picture, it's a picture of 1799. They are Georgian buildings, but they replace earlier buildings. And beyond them, on the other side of those buildings, was the marketplace of Boston, the centre of Boston in many ways. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we have a picture. Again, this is 1744, very similar to what it was in the 1600s. At the bottom of the picture on the left-hand side, you can see there's lines that are close in with each other. That is marking the River Witham, and in the middle of that section of the river, you've got the bridge shown itself, and that leads by circuitous route into the marketplace. The marketplace is sort of crescent-shaped, and it is close to the main features. Just to the top left-hand corner is that is where the parish church of St. Botolph is located. And just to the south of the map, to the bottom of the map, is in fact the Pack House Quay, which I showed the previous picture of. Just to explain some of the oddities in this particular map, when it was drawn, they put the east side at the top of the map. And I've reorientated it so that north is now at the top. But this means that all of the lettering is been moved around sort of 90 degrees, and so numbers like 31 or whatever, they're actually shown sideways rather than that. And also they put drawings of the buildings in, but they are sideways as well. But that's an oddity. This does, the point of showing you this is to explain the shape of the marketplace. One feature that I will refer to later is you can see towards them between the parish church and the marketplace, you have got a building that's roughly rectangular with a little bit added on the south side. That was the town jail, which I'll be referring to later. So that was located in the marketplace. Some of the other buildings that are shown in there were late sort of 18th century additions, but the lanes on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of this picture, they're all similar to what they were at the present. In the 17th century, they were the same as they were at a later date. Next slide, please. That's showing the plan. This is a picture taken just last year within the marketplace, showing that this area, which has been the marketplace for over 900 years, is still being used for that original purpose. So that in the same way that in the year 1100, there would have been stalls in that marketplace selling food and clothes and other things and what people needed in their houses. So that is still the case 900 years later. And so we have this modern photograph showing stalls very much as the stalls would have been at that period, except the difference would have been where these have got metal poles to form the structure, they would have been wooden stalls, and where they have got plastic topping over the top, it probably would have been canvas at that date. But again, selling often the same sorts of things, fruit, vegetables, meat, clothing, all sorts of things that they would be purchasing then and which we are purchasing now. There will be some slight changes. For example, I don't think that in the medieval period there were many cell phones for sale. But apart from changes like that, this marketplace is still performing the same function that it's been performing for 900 years. And you can see just in the background as part of the parish church. Next, please. Right, so that's given you an overview of various parts of Boston. Let's have an overview of the whole picture. This again is from the 1740s, a map of the town. And again, I've reorientated it, put north at the top, shows the river flowing through the town. There is a slight deviation in correction in this map. In the top left-hand corner, it shows it going north. It should actually go west because there's a big bend at that particular point. But apart from that, everything in this map is correct. What you're seeing is that essentially the town, most of the town is on the east bank on the right-hand side, and a little bit on the left bank, the west side of the town. Much of that just one street going down south towards High Street and a few lanes around the western end of the town bridge. On the sort of east bank, You've got the marketplace and streets to the north and to the south of it, following the bank. The only extension that, and this started in the Middle Ages and it continued to the present, and the town's expanded beyond later. But as you can see in the top right-hand corner, it's an area called Wide Bargate. And if the map actually, it gives an indication as to why that gets its name, because it is essentially a funnel-shaped street, as it was, and it widens out and had to contain a marketplace where cattle, horses, sheep, pigs, and other livestock were for sale. So this became a reflection of Boston's importance in the medieval period for the sale of sheep and for wool. So particularly for livestock, they had this extension, this market, this additional market. So Boston had 2 or 3 marketplaces at the need demanded in the Middle Ages. But other parts of the town declined after the year 1300, and that's why you've still got other fields coming very close up behind the town on either side of the top and both sides of this particular map. Next, please. So in the 1600s, there was still a number of medieval buildings surviving, and this one is particularly important. It was called Geyser's Hall, very much in the centre of the town. This was to the south of Packhouse Quay. And the significance of this is that up until 1546, Boston didn't have any form of town government. Other towns and cities, they got a municipal corporation, some of them going back to the 1100s, 1200s, and that had not elected bodies, they were self-appointed bodies, but it did have local people running their own affairs. Boston didn't have that, so an awful lot of power vested with the Lord of the Manor. In the case of Boston, the Lord of the Manor was usually a person who was a great noble and was absentee. This was because it was part of a collection of manors that was controlled by the crown and would be given to one noble person. And if that person, the crown, wanted to change their mind, they could take it away and give it to somebody else. So it was always the actual lord was an absentee, but they would appoint managers, as it were, as you might refer to them, to actually come to the town and to manage the affairs and the powers of the Lord of the Manor, which were very influential when the town was actually quite as prosperous as Boston. And this particular building was that local headquarters of the Lord of the Manor's officials within the town. It served 2 functions. It had those officials based within it, not taking up very much space, not like modern bureaucracies, but the building was also a warehouse. And this actually survived until 1816, when it was demolished and replaced by a larger one. But I say the significance is this shows that it was the power of the Lord of the Manor was quite significant up until that period in the reign of Henry VIII, when Boston got a municipal corporation, which I'll mention a bit more about later. Next slide, please. Another building which survived at that date and which still survives to the present day and is owned by the Boston Borough Council.
Okay, sounds good.
Sure.
This was built in 1482, named after Lord Hussey, who was a later owner, but Lord Hussey was executed for treason, so that passed into the ownership of the Crown and in due course passed to Boston Corporation. There were a few other medieval buildings, but these were the 2 most significant ones, apart from the parish church and the Guildhall, which I'll be coming to in a moment. Next slide, please. Right, so Boston did get a corporation in 1546, and just to briefly explain that situation, summarising it very briefly, King Henry VIII, come the Reformation, he took control of the, he suppressed many aspects of the Catholic Church, including closing all the monasteries, closing friaries. He suppressed the Order of St. John. Now, all of those organisations, monasteries, from the time when Boston was important in the medieval period, monasteries had a building, not necessarily a religious building, but a building where they could attend in order for the officials to sell their wool and to buy anything that was necessary. So they owned lots of lots of monasteries owned small buildings within Boston. The king got hold of those. The friaries, he got hold of those. The Order of St. John, they had a building within Boston. The king got that when he suppressed the local branch of the order. I said Lord Hussey had been executed. Lord Hussey was executed by the king because he failed to put down a rebellion in Lincolnshire, and for that he paid the penalty. So the king got Hussey Tower, another property of Lord Hussey. Another element was that I talked about the lordship of Boston being part of a big group. Henry VIII had given it to one of his illegitimate sons, and that son had died. So the lordship of the manor had also reverted back to the crown, and that included the appointment of various officials. The Order of St. John, who I mentioned, should have said they had also become the owners of the right to appoint the vicar. Now, difficult to think of that in modern days, but in fact, the right to appoint the vicar was quite a significant thing and could be sold from one person to another. It had been owned by the Abbey of St. Mary in York, but in the late 1400s, the Order of St. John had got that right. So when they were suppressed, the king got the right to appoint the vicar. So he was getting a tremendous amount of property, rights and privileges in Boston. And he could simply have appointed a manager to look after all that, but instead the solution was the local people, the richest local people in the town were told, look, if you raise sufficient money and make a gift to the king, you're not actually buying rights, but if you give the king a gift of money, he will give you a charter in return. And so they got a charter. This gave them an awful lot of property that the king had seized around the town, but it also gave them the right to send 2 members of parliament. They had occasionally sent members to parliament before, but this guaranteed that as a chartered borough, they could send 2 members to every parliament. They also they acquired, therefore, the right to appoint the vicar and similar sorts of privileges, and as well as the liabilities that were there. The corporation was named, the members of the corporation were named, and that consisted of a mayor, alderman, and councilman, and a recorder and a town clerk. And so this became such a significant, but all the wealthiest men were named within the members of the corporation, and they now had a formal legal body to actually run the town. And so to represent this prestigious new organization, they were granted a coat of arms, which you can see represented here. To be honest, nobody knows why it's got 3 crowns on. The only suggestion was that Boston had a trading connection with Cologne, and Cologne was where the 3 kings who went to attend the birth of Jesus actually died in Cologne, and so that is why. So they represent the 3 kings who died in Cologne, who had been at the birth of Jesus Christ. Believe that if you like. But it shows that the town actually had a corporation, and because its wealth was built upon the sea and trading with the sea, the supporters are 2 mermaids, which are on either side. And up above the top of the coat of arms, again, really representing the wealth of the town, is a wool sack. It's a sack and that is represented to show that it's wool. They've actually got a drawing of a lamb on the top of it, or a sheep on the top of it, because Boston's medieval prosperity had been built on wool. Right, next slide, please. One of their responsibilities of the corporation was looking after the town bridge. There'd been a town bridge. The earliest reference we've got is in 1301, but there could have been bridges before that. The town, say, was established about 1086. But we certainly know that there's regularly, the bridge had to be rebuilt about every 100 years or so. You can look at the drawing of this particular bridge, which is about 1800. That bridge is not going to last very long. Bridges should be going up in an arch, not coming down in an arch. So this was why they needed to replace. So that was the corporation's responsibility, to maintain the town bridge. And in return, the crown had been given, the corporation had been given the right to charge tolls for people crossing, not local people, but for other people who were crossing the bridge. They could charge a toll for using the bridge, and that would help towards the cost of maintaining and repairing it. Next, please. This is the Guild Hall. This hall had been built in 1190. So again, over 800 years old. And this had been the hall of the Guild of St. Mary. Up until the corporation being formed, the most powerful organisation, local organisation within the town, had been the individual guilds. And St. Mary's Guild and Corpus Christi Guild were extremely wealthy organisations. They themselves owned property, and they included the leading men of the town. So it was the leading men who were in St. Mary's Guild and the other guilds who became members of the corporation. And they basically decided, well, now that we've got a corporation, we don't need to keep the guilds anyway. They are old-fashioned organizations related still to the Catholic Church very much. So the guilds all dissolved themselves and transferred their property and rights over to the corporation. This meant the corporation received this building, which was the largest of the halls of any of the guilds, and this became effectively the town hall. This was where the corporation managed their affairs. on the on the first floor, sorry, I'm being English, on what we call the first floor, what you would call the second floor, there were 3 main rooms. There was a courtroom where trials could be held by the magistrates. And I should say that the magistrates, the charter gave them freedom from magistrates outside Boston. They had their own magistrates who were the mayor, 4 of the aldermen, and the recorder. Those 6 people were the magistrates for the borough of Boston, and they could meet in the Guildhall to hold their trial, to hold court. There was another meeting room for the actual corporation itself, and a very large room for public meetings, and that is still used to this day for important civic public meetings of various sorts. So that was the importance of the Guildhall. This was where they ran the town from. And also, if they had important guests, the benefit of having a large public meeting room within that is if they had honoured guests come to visit the town, this was where they could be taken into and entertained while they were there. And that continued as the use of the town hall effectively from 1546 to 1830s. So a very long time, nearly 300 years. Next slide, please. Looking more closely at the period of Boston in 1600, this is a 3-story building, which is now called, I put it in quotes because it's now called Shropshires Hall, but I don't think that was what it was called in the Puritan period. They probably didn't associate that particular name with it. But the significance is this is a photograph pre-1870 when the building was restored and changed quite considerably. But what it shows is that you've got 2 stories at one end of the building and 3 stories on the right. And this was unusual in having a 3rd floor, in that most buildings bottom were very similar to this, but they were only 2 stories high. This was the standard sort of arrangement within Boston. So I've looked at so far the big grand buildings that have survived from the medieval period. But by the time you're getting to the 1600s, Boston is essentially a small market town and port. No new grand buildings have been put up, and most of the people and most of the shops and other premises would be 2-story buildings of a similar sort of design to this building. As you can see, looking at each floor, the floor above overhangs the floor below, what is called jetted buildings. So a jetty overhanging the floor below, and that was fairly standard for buildings of this period. So this is what much of the town of Boston would have looked like. Next, please. Another responsibility for the corporation when they were created was the grammar school. Some of the friars had some of the guilds had employed teachers, first to teach a small number of perhaps the sons and members of the guild, but those had ended when the guilds were abolished. So the corporation took on responsibility. As it says here, a grammar school was created as such in 1546 when the corporation took on the responsibility, and in 1567 they built this particular building that is shown here, and that continued nearly for 300 years. The building is still part of the grammar school, but now a much larger school has been built behind it and all around it, but this building is still retained as the school library. But for 300 years, this single building was actually the whole of the corporation, the whole of the school. And the corporation appointed 2 masters, the headmaster and an usher, as they were called. And these, again, getting into the period when the Puritans were dominating the town. And so within the early 1600s, they were appointing Puritans to the post of master and usher within the school. So in all aspects of town, we're becoming very much dominated by Puritans. Next, please. As it became a Puritan town, it attracted people from elsewhere. And I'll say what was the impetus for that in a moment. But it included people like we have Richard Bellingham. We have a few pictures from portraits from this sort of period for people who later became involved in the foundation of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And Richard Bellingham was one of these people. His family came from North Lincolnshire. He moved to Boston and became heavily involved on the corporation. He served as deputy recorder, or that was one of the judges, one of the effectively the magistrates of the town. So that was one of his posts, as he was a judge within the borough of Boston. And in 1628, he became the member of Parliament as well, representing to us. This was just before, a few years later, Charles I dissolved Parliament, and tried to rule without Parliament. But so technically, Bellingham continued until he was replaced several years later, when the Parliament won the Civil War, effectively. Bellingham became active, very, as you see, a recorder, member of Parliament, a leading member of the Corporation of Boston, and a key figure within, able to become a figure involved in the plans for creating the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is very much the ideas. There were many Boston men, leading Boston men, who were involved in the creation of that colony. He himself was one of those who emigrated and became one of the colony's governors in due course. Next, please. Having started now to talk about the creation of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, this is Tattershall Castle. It's 10 miles north of Boston. At that date, the 1600s, early 1600s, it would have had, this is the tower, which is the main residence within the castle, but it would have had, where in the foreground of the walls would have encircled it. What happened at the Civil War, Parliament was worried that if there was a rebellion, rebels might occupy castles and it would be difficult to attack them. So the Parliament had a policy of demolishing castles. The Earl of Lincoln, who lived in this castle, he was a parliamentary supporter. So understandably enough, when the Parliament came instructed that his castle should be demolished, he said, but this is my main home, this is my main residence. So what they did, they spared the great tower that you can see here, but the outer buildings, they were demolished. So he saved the important bit. The residential bit at the centre was saved. Now, he was a parliamentary supporter. He was also a Puritan. And in fact, he did, at this state, he had inherited at quite a young age. His mother continued to live at Sempringham, which is 16 miles to the west of Boston. And his mother and the Earl himself were both very much involved in the creation of the Massachusetts Bay Company, colony, many, in fact, company and colony. So that some of the meetings were held at Sempringham, and the Earl was involved. Also, his officials, he had Thomas Dudley, because he was a young man, a relative of the Earl had sent Thomas Dudley to help him manage his estate. He was just taking over the estate and said, here we are, Thomas Dudley, he can be your manager and help you to actually run the estate. So Thomas Dudley arrived, served for a number of years, and when he retired, his son-in-law, Simon Bradstreet, took over that job as steward to the Earl of Lincoln. And in fact, they were a family, say son-in-law, because Bradstreet actually married the daughter of Thomas Dudley. And this connection between the family, the Earl of Lincoln's family, and the creation of the colony was marked by the Earl's sister, Lady Arbella, who actually married Isaac Johnson, a Puritan from Stamford originally, but he was involved in creating the colony and the company, and was said to be one of the major financiers of the company. So there's now Tattershall Castle and Sempringham very much centred where a lot of the planning for the creation of it. Why were they wanting to create it? This was because Boston had become a Puritan centre, with leading officials Puritans holding leading officials within the town, and they were feeling that that was a secure settlement. And the idea of moving out was they were now getting pressure by the late 1620s to conform to the standards of the Church of England, to the extent that Puritans did not necessarily want to follow some of those practices because they perhaps thought they were Catholic. And also Parliament, the king had suggested the Parliament and was trying to raise all sorts of illegal taxes and putting pressure on people to pay them, which they thought were not right. And so there was resistance, there was pressure coming on from political purposes, political, financial and taxation purposes, as well as religious pressure was on the town. So this was leading to the feeling that they needed to take some action. If they couldn't survive this, what would happen to the town? Could they actually transfer Boston to somewhere else? Next slide, please. Just to change tack slightly, to go back a couple of years to 1607, you will have heard of the Pilgrim Fathers. Their first effort to try and these people separatists from North Nottinghamshire and South Yorkshire, they were about sort of 50, 60 miles away from Boston. They sought to leave England in 1607. And they did this because they had a contact, a family relationship in the Spalding area, which is close to Boston, who would be able to give them advice, information about ships, and got them in contact with shipping. So they tried to flee from England by sailing from Boston, join a ship in the Haven, so halfway between Boston and the Wash. But they were betrayed by the ship's captain and were had to appear before the magistrates in Boston. So these cells still survive underneath the courtroom in the Guildhall. I know some people in the past have taken a romantic view, and they've suggested, oh, this was where the Puritan Pilgrim Fathers were imprisoned. I think that imprisonment means that you're detained there for a long time as a punishment. These cells, certainly the Puritan Pilgrim Fathers would have been held here, but like any modern court, they will have some cells nearby where people who are accused and are about to appear in court, they will be held in the cells before they actually are taken into the courtroom itself. That's a modern practice, and that is exactly, this is the equivalent. In fact, you can see the two cells, and just to the right of them, you can see that black section going up into the roof. That is the spiral staircase that went up into the box in the courtroom that was immediately above here. It is often felt that this happened in 1607 and the emigration in 1630 and nearly 25 years later, and that there was no connection between the two. But what we now know, it was that one gentleman who was evidently coming to Boston as part of that group that were trying to flee was called Leonard Beatson. The people who, Bradford, Brewston and their followers, failed to escape. They had to return to North Nottinghamshire and later left the country by Immingham and got to the Netherlands. But what we now know is that Leonard Beatson, who was with them while they were in Boston, decided to stay in the town. So he stayed in Boston, became a draper and a leading member of John Cotton's congregation. So John Cotton, I'll mention later, was the very inspiring vicar and Puritan vicar of the town of Boston. So I think if Beatson had lived until 1630 or later, he would have been part of that 1630 migration. So now Leonard Beatson is actually a link between the Pilgrim Fathers and then the Great Migration that started from the 1630s. Next slide, please. This, having referred to that, this is the building which was the prison in the marketplace. I referred to when we were looking at the map of the marketplace. So in this building, the building on the right is the actual town jail. The area to the left was the ostrich inn and other shops around there. But if they were held in prison, and that would only have been perhaps for a few weeks or so, and we're not even sure that that happened. Certainly the congregation, some of them who were actually staying in Boston for a little while, and they were able to have illegal religious meetings. Next, please. Other members of the town, as well as those people had come to Boston. Bellingham, who, as I said, came to Boston from outside the town. There were other families within the town that were Puritans. The Leverets, Alderman Thomas Leverett was an alderman of the corporation. This is his son, John. And John, in due course, was one of those who emigrated to North America and in due course became one of the governors of the colony of Massachusetts Bay. So that there were Boston people who had been here for generations who were Puritans, but there were also people being attracted to the town simply because of its Puritan ethos. Next, please. This is Simon Bradstreet, we've already referred to, the son-in-law of Thomas Dudley. And again, he became a future governor of the colony, as Dudley himself did. So you've got here at least 4 members that I've mentioned: Bellingham, Leverett, Dudley and Bradstreet, closely connected with the town of Boston in the 1620s, if not earlier, and then becoming governors in the colony once it is established. Remember that the colony, once established, elected its own governors because they took the charter with them. Next, please. This is a rather boring picture, but what it symbolises is that we know from the historical records that the Earl of Lincoln had a house in Boston, and the indications are that it was on the location that is shown here. That house existed in 1741. It was still there, shown as being there in 1741, but sometime after that it was demolished, and we've got these other buildings erected on the site. So this was in Wide Bargate in Boston. I put the slide in because it won't mean much to people here in the US, but actually people in Boston, Lincolnshire, they will be able to identify just where this particular building was located. And while that belonged to the Earl of Lincoln, it certainly Isaac Johnson and Lady Arbella would occasionally have come to Boston to attend John Cotton's sermons and to meet with other people who were involved in the creation, as it was, the creation of the Massachusetts Bay Company and Colony. So this is the particular location where they would have stayed when they came into Boston. So again, what I'm establishing is that a whole lot of people, even like Isaac Johnson, had some connection with Boston, staying here for part of the time. Next slide, please. And if we call right back to the original slide that I started, or one of the original slides, it showed that the parish of Skirbeck almost surrounded Boston. It was encircled it on three sides. And in the early 1600s, the person appointed as rector, the charge of the parish church of Skirbeck, was Samuel Whiting. And he, like John Cotton in Boston, was also a Puritan. The Whitings actually were a prominent Boston family. So Samuel had gone away to university to be educated, come back and he had got an appointment, a religious appointment somewhere else, but they disapproved of his puritanical views. So he came back to Boston area and got the job as rector of Skirbeck Parish. But being from a fairly wealthy family, expected to live in good conditions. So rather than living in the church that was provided for the rectors of Skirbeck, he took the lease of this building here. This is called Hussey Hall. It is next to Hussey Tower, which you can see on the right, and further behind in the back of the picture, you can just see the tower of the parish church. So again, Whiting, as rector of Skirbeck, was also one of those people who had emigrated to Massachusetts. He was married to a cousin of Oliver Cromwell, and Oliver Cromwell himself, although it didn't happen, did at least consider at one point moving over to the colony. But so you've got another link here, a prominent person within Boston who actually again becomes involved in that movement to Massachusetts. Next slide, please. I've talked a lot about John Cotton. John Cotton was appointed as the vicar of Boston in 1616, and this pulpit had been erected just a few years earlier, and this pulpit is still in use at the present, and this was the pulpit from which John Cotton gave his sermons. He was a leading Puritan theologian, so well thought of. He'd come from Cambridge University, but other students were sent from Cambridge to stay with John Cotton because they felt that he could, by discussing theological matters with him, they could actually learn. So this was virtually an outpost of Cambridge University for purpose that people were being sent here to learn more in relation to Puritan theology. Next, please. So all of the people attracted to Boston were attracted to John Cotton's sermons. And this building was the vicarage that he would have lived in for a while he was in that position. Excuse me. Right. So he was an inspiring leader who attracted people to Boston. Those many of which I've mentioned already. Also, Anne Hutchinson, who came from Alford. So again, that's about 15 miles from Boston. They would come here again to hear she and her family would come here to hear John Cotton's sermons. So she was very inspired by him, and she, of course, also emigrated to Massachusetts. And people who know a bit about Massachusetts history will know that became a very controversial issue involving Cotton and Hutchinson. So again, they first knew each other while they were here in Lincolnshire together. Next slide, please. This is just a symbolic representation of the Arbella. The significance again is shown, the relationship to the Earl of Lincoln and to Boston, that when the fleet set off a number of ships to take the first migrants over to New England in 1630, the lead ship was actually named Arbella in honor of Lady Arbella. As I said, has got Boston connections. and several people, including St Johnson as well as Arbella, actually sailed on this particular fleet. At the time when the actual migration took place, planning had been going on for 2 or 3 years, sometimes in, as I say, in Sempringham and Tattershall and Boston and elsewhere. And the Boston men could have been the person chosen as governor. It just seems to me interesting that Boston men had been involved very much in that early planning, but the position of governor at the time of the first fleet actually sailing was given to somebody who was not one of the Boston men. And so I just wonder, and this is just a thought, I shouldn't be saying this as a historian, I ought to be saying factual information, but you just sometimes have a situation where there's simply, you say, oh, we've got to appoint a senior person, and there's a group of people that we can select that person from, but Mr. A might object if Mr. B is appointed, saying, well, I'm as good as him, I don't want to be the leader. Mr. B might say, I'm as good as Mr. A, I don't want to serve under him as leader. So the solution is what we're well known, the phrase, a compromise candidate. So was it that to avoid differences between the various Boston men that were involved, did they bring in an outsider? Now, I shouldn't have said that because I have no historical reason for saying so, but it just strikes me as an interesting thought that he hadn't been involved so much as some of these other people involved in the Lincolnshire connection of the creation of the company, but they did appoint him at that particular point. Right.
That would be John Winthrop, right?
Sorry, yes, with John Winthrop. Yeah, sorry. Right, next slide, please. And this is a picture drawn from the windows of St. Botolph's Church. And this shows John Cotton going down to Southampton to see the colonists at the first fleet actually leaving to go across to Massachusetts. John Cotton himself sailed 3 years later. And this shows that once they actually arrived in Massachusetts and established them, to my mind, and again, it seems to me what you have got, the situation which we have got, is that within Boston in Lincolnshire, they have created a community in which Puritans have the position of being the mayor, the teacher, master of the grammar school, the member of Parliament, aldermen, several members of the council, the vicar in charge of the parish church, the teachers in the grammar school. All of these are Puritans, and they support each other. In some of the towns, you might have leading mayor and alderman being Puritan and being criticised by the vicar of the town for not behaving because of their behaviour and their religious beliefs, or conversely, you could have a vicar taking puritanical views and being criticised by the magistrates and others. In Boston's case, there was no such criticism. There was Puritan ethos accepted. Of course, as a group, and particularly interested in theology and religion, they would be constant discussions and interesting, probably even disagreements. But there's a difference between agreements among a common party that have a common interest, arguing about how to develop their own ideas, and criticism coming from outside forces. And in Boston's case, there was agreement within the town, and the nearest outside forces were the Bishop of Lincoln, who had some authority over the church, but the Bishop of Lincoln was taking an attitude, well, he had a disagreement with Archbishop Laud, who was really pressing for conformity at a national level. And so the bishop, just to be awkward, just wrote to the people of Boston and said, are you satisfied with I'm putting it roughly, are you satisfied with the religious guidance which the old town is receiving from your vicar? And they said, absolutely, he's giving us exactly the right sort of religious guidance and support which we want, which he was. It wasn't actually what the official Anglican position should have been, but the corporate, the town was receiving the sort of religious guidance which they wanted. So the bishop said, well, I'm satisfied that they're getting just what they want in the way of religious guidance and support, and the vicar is doing his job in that particular context. The other influence of many English towns would be the local nobleman, who would be outside and have influence in various ways within the nearest town that he was to his particular state. As I've said, the nearest nobleman to Boston was the Earl of Lincoln, who was himself a Puritan involved in creation of the Massachusetts Bay Company. So these two nearest external influences, the bishop and the nobleman, they were both complete supporting. So Boston, they had got not only coherence within the town, they had got support from the nearest external authorities as well. So my feeling is what they were trying to do when they emigrated to Massachusetts, the Boston men as they approached it, they say, in Boston, we have got the sort of community we want. So when their name Boston was given to the new settlement, I think that was almost a branding. It wasn't just a nostalgia for Boston that they left behind, but Boston, the name Boston represented the sort of community, Puritan dominated community that they wanted to transplant. And so I see it as much more than just nostalgia or naming the town for the place you've left. There was the culture in that place they've left, which they wanted to recreate in a new settlement. So that is how my thought as to one of the reasons why they were chosen. It wasn't just that they wanted to encourage John Cotton to come over or for any nostalgic reason. I think they wanted to say this is the new Boston. They didn't call it New Boston, they just called it Boston. They didn't need to call it new because they're saying we are transporting it from England to New England. Next, please. I'm now going to jump. That is very much dealt with, I think, the foundation of Boston, and as I see it. But there have been links since then between the two Bostons in looking at them. So I put in this first reference here is to the Cotton Chapel. You're having to jump forward 200 years, in effect. And interestingly, we had the War of 1812 between Britain and the US. But then by 1820, you have the commemoration of the foundation of Plymouth Plantation by the Pilgrim Fathers, as they were called. And that then starts to revive people thinking about the connection, the foundation, that their origins in England in creating the new parts of the United States. And in Boston, in the case of Boston in particular, there was a gentleman called Pilgrim Fisher Thompson, who actually, as a young man, he was actually very interested in statistics and finance. He moved over to Washington, D.C. and opened a bookshop. Interestingly, he became the secretary of the first Unitarian church that was established in Washington. And amongst the congregation were Paul Fitch from Boston and also John Quincy Adams. They were also Unitarians. And Fisher Thompson, therefore, as the secretary of that church, would have had close dealings with people from Boston in Massachusetts. He was there for about 25 years. In the 1840s, he retired and moved back to England. And from that point onwards, he is promoting links between the two towns, so much so that in 1856, when the parish church of St. Barthol's was restored, there was a disused chapel in part of the church. And his suggestion was, in connection with local people, that should be created as renamed and dedicated as a chapel to John Cotton. And much of the funding for that was about 2/3 of the funding. I think it cost about 600 and about £400. £400 was raised in New England. And that was brought over and paid for the restoration of the Cotton Chapel. And this illustration, one of the windows in the parish church shows the dedication of that particular chapel. Unfortunately, they're showing the Union Jackets quite prominently, but the American flag is just hidden behind the column in the middle. But it is there, so that is the American flag and British flag side by side of that particular dedication. And so that was just the first of one. They followed that up in a little bit later. The money was paid for the restoration of the Guildhall in 1907. Next slide, please. And then in the 1920s, they recognised that the towers of the parish church were getting into a very bad way. So funds were raised, and a very large part of that funding came from the United States, particularly New England in particular. Then in the 1930s, because of that, the links were established throughout the 1930s. There were exchange visits between the mayor of Boston, Massachusetts, and the mayor of Boston, Lincolnshire, and other dignitaries going from one place to another. So that continues for much of that particular decade. And as part of that, involved within those changes, in 1938, Joseph Kennedy, who was ambassador to the Court of St. James, ambassador to Britain, effectively, attended and opened a room in Fidel House, one of the preserved buildings in Boston, and that was dedicated as the American Room, so that Americans who visit the town are invited, welcome to go and have a room, which actually had some of the pictures of the men that I've just shown you in there. And that has gone. There were then a little bit of a gap. One event that did happen, in fact, during the Second World War, when there were a large number of American troops in the UK, on one year, I forget which exactly, I think it was on the 4th of July in one occasion, or it might have been Thanksgiving. I must admit I've not identified which year it was. There was a large parade of American forces to attend church on that particular day, and the flag was carried through the door of the church and paraded into church and away from church. So that was a great link between the two. And then in recent years, the last 25 years, as Roxanne said at the start, the Partnership of Historic Bostons has been established to spread knowledge about the links between the two Bostons, and is also expanded in many ways to look at other culture aspects of the culture of the history of Massachusetts within the colonial period. And so that has brought us very much up to date. Next slide, please. This is Judy Cabot, is the lady on the right-hand side. She and her husband John were very much involved in the side in Boston, in Lincolnshire, in promoting the links between the two. And he is shown having a meeting with some of the members of the First Church in Boston, as well as the vicar of St. Botolph's. So again, this meeting took place as part of the process of establishing the partnership and establishing links again, reviving links between the two Bostons. So I think that's brought me to the end of my talk. I hope you found it interesting. I find it a fascinating subject. And I'm pleased to have had this opportunity to give this talk on behalf of the partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That was great. And let me stop sharing and we will go back to here. And I am going to start looking at the chat. Apologies, folks, I couldn't see the chat or couldn't manipulate it when I was showing the slides that Neil had. So let's see what we've got for questions. I had tons of questions coming up. Actually, an observation as I skim through the chat here. We've got people from all over the country. Liz from Boston. I don't know which Boston that is. Perhaps that's better. That way, we've got folks from Leicestershire, Virginia, the East Fens, Boston here. That means Boston, Lincolnshire. That's just lovely. Still looking for questions here. People commenting on the tower. And what I really enjoyed, Neil, was that you can see the tower from almost all of those pictures. So let me start with a question of mine as I then figure out what other people's questions are, which is what led to the decline of Boston, actually before or as the corporation was forming, the corporation of Boston, England, not the corporation of Mass Bay. What actually led to that decline? Because it was what, the second most wealthy, powerful, or the second most economically powerful city in England for a long while.
Well, actually, it's you have to be more specific as to what it was. It is the fact that they handled the second largest amount of wool exports. So it was the commerce of the town that was actually singing. But in fact, a lot of that would be merchants coming from London and other places descending on Boston. So it would be the equivalent, say, of a World's Fair, where people come from all over the world to see things. And think of that as a World's Fair as a trades fair, where they're coming together to carry out. Boston was a place where people converged from all over. Representatives came from monasteries to sell their wool, and noblemen also came to sell their wool. But that meant the money, they got money in their pocket from the selling, so they needed then to buy their needs. So they might, if they were from the aristocracy, they might buy falcons or luxuries and silks that would be brought to Boston. Other people would be buying important timber and other sorts of things. So it was a case that people were coming in, selling. Wool was the largest, most important export from England at the time. So the most money would be gathered together because the sales were taking place as wool was exported. And then the money in the pocket, they said, well, this is now the time for other people wanting to sell things to monasteries or the abbeys or to the aristocracy or to royalty would come. So the wealth was based on that. But then apart from when the fair was actually happening, and at some point it said the fair actually went on for several weeks. But because you're getting to the 1400s, wool is ceasing to be an important export. People are starting to make wool into cloth within England. The cloth industry is actually building. There had been one, the cloth industry, but it was starting to grow in importance. And then there's wars between us and France and others, and the government are needing money to raise money for taxation. So they're putting taxation on wool and things like that. So there is economic pressure to take away. So it was a long process that related really to economic forces beyond Boston's control. It wasn't any problem in Boston as such. It was just political issues that were taking, wars that were breaking out, financial, industrial development that was taking place within the country. So a whole range of factors. And so the irony is that just as they were ceasing to be prosperous about 1300, it's 1306 that they start to build their parish church, because they must have been accumulating money over the last 200 years and thinking, well, we've now got the funds, we can actually build a really big church, which they did. It took them 250 years because the last bit of the tower was finished in about 1520, 1530.
Fascinating. And why this site 12 wiggly miles in from the actual coast?
Right, that's because it's a convergence of two routes. The River Witham is important. Lincoln is also, as we say, Boston's important trade. Lincoln also had lots of merchants so that they were sending their goods. So they could send them in rivercraft, but the rivercraft were big enough to go out to sea. So they could send them down the river. But as I said, in the fens, nobody lived in the fen, but there was a line of villages between the fens and the coast. That's to the east of Boston. So that road that came down, it converged with the road that came, the walls were north of Boston, and there was a road that came down. So those two roads from the north and from the east converge, and they then came into Boston, where the town bridge is. And then they crossed over, and there was a road that then down, because they had to go on higher land rather than through the fens. So there was a road going south, which eventually went to London. So it's where that main road crossed the river. That's where the town grew up. I add a little bit to it. I think St. Botolph was originally the parish church of Skirbeck. And that makes sense because crossing the river at that point, the river, when the tide, because the waters could come in and they could spread out over the fens, there's a lot of water there that at low tide then had to go out very quickly because to go through a very narrow gap. So that channel where the town bridge is, for example, would have been extremely dangerous to cross before a bridge was built. And so it makes sense, therefore, because of that dangerous situation, it was a classic situation, they built a chapel next to where bridges are now. You'll often find there's a medieval chapel because previously it would have been a ford or a ferry, and that was very dangerous. So you actually went in, and while they were waiting, say, for the ferry to go or the water to go down, you could go into and say, please let me get across this river safely. So I think that's why St. Botolph's Church is right next to where that river crossing is.
Oh, that's fantastic. And
I give you long answers.
yeah, I know. I love the long answers. Sadly, I give long answers too. But it just shows the importance of geography. So,
Oh yeah.
a question that came up: if there is so much support for Puritanism within Boston, Lincolnshire, and sort of the surrounding areas, and so much, literally power there for it, what was the reason to leave? Was it repression or support going away or what?
Oh, it was increasing pressure. It had got to the situation where, as I said in the talk, the Bishop of Lincoln was quite tolerant towards it. And in actual fact, that meant the Bishop of Lincoln at a later date, when you're moving on a bit later, would actually had to appear before a court of the church for saying that he was allowing some things that he shouldn't do. So he got into trouble for being too lenient. So that shows that at the centre they were increasing pressure to ensure church conformity, and at the same time politically, as I said, King Charles dissolved Parliament, and he was trying. The Crown has got ancient rights, and sort of, 300 years ago, they would have said that the Crown has a right to do this. So instead of having to go to Parliament to pass law to enlarge taxes, the King would say, well, I have got hereditary right to charge a finance for this sort of thing. So they were using all sorts of financial pressures. Some people say, and this is reminiscent, of course, in leading to the American Revolution. Some people say these are not proper taxes. We should be able to sit in Parliament to decide what taxes are going to be put on us. And people were refusing to pay and were being put in prison for not paying the taxes. So there's a little irony there between the American Revolution situation, people refusing to pay the taxes and being put in prison by King Charles. A situation happened 150 years later. But that was the, say, religious pressure and financial and political pressure being put on the people. And John Cotton himself, because he was being summoned, he actually went into hiding for a couple of years before he actually sort of emigrated. So the pressure was getting, this was felt, they were fearing there was so much pressure on Boston, the Puritan Boston, it might actually have been cracked and crumbled and destroyed if they didn't actually, because they could only resist so far if the king was using legal powers and imprisoning people for not doing what he wanted. So I think that it was a last resort. I think they would have liked to stay in Boston, but the pressure was just getting too much, not from the church and political.
So did much wealth flow from Boston, England, or Boston, Lincolnshire, I should say, over to the new Boston, Massachusetts? Did wealth follow with the people immigrating?
It would just be their own personal wealth that would have gone with them. And okay, it's important. In fact, it is said that probably about 5,000 population in Boston, said be almost about 250 people actually emigrate. Not only those that I mentioned, the leading one, but about 250 people in total would have been. But that still leaves, over 4,000 people left in Boston. And so that there would have been, it would, you lose, say, 5% of your population. It has certain effects, but it doesn't actually destroy the town. And so there might have been other people, just the bits we haven't publicised so much, people who resented the dominance of the Puritans, and some might have been quite pleased to see some of these Puritans actually leaving. And I say that with qualification, because when we get to the Civil War, which is only going to happen about another sort of 10 or 12 years later, Boston was still a stronghold for the parliamentary cause and stayed rigidly and loyally to Parliament. So that, again, that's still, the Parliament was linked with Puritanism to that extent. So, but the town, I think, survived. It would have had some consequences, but the town survived.
So a couple of questions here. Sort of first, do we know if Archbishop Laud and that crew, were they intending to target John Cotton and Boston? Was that a very conscious target of on their part?
I think they were targeting anybody who was, they had the Book of Common Prayer, which said what services where's to be used in which services and what clothes the clergy were to wear. And that was very rigid, and they were picking on anybody who didn't conform with that. So Cotton was only picked on to this extent that he was not conforming to them. But in fact, there's one clergyman who was, and I forget the reference because I've seen it in somebody's, who said, how come that I get persecuted where John Cotton can do as much as he likes and doesn't get punished? This is because while he'd got the Puritan ethos in the town, the magistrates were protecting him, and the Bishop of Lincoln had said there's nothing wrong. So to that extent, other Puritan clergy were already previously suffering because of the way they were behaving and the services they are not conforming to the Church of England. But John Cotton basically survived longer than some others in his position.
Interesting. So we got a couple of questions that I'm intrigued on. One, and I'm going to do them two together. What happened to Boston, England during the Civil War? And then Yves Laplante is asking, and I don't know if this happened during the Civil War or not. Would you please tell, Yves, by the way, is one of historian of Anne Hutchinson, and member of the Boston. She's an advisor to Boston Partnership. Would you please tell the story of the destruction of church art inside St. Botolph's by members of Cotton's congregation in 1621? And was this a response to the bishop or what?
Anyway, let's deal with the first one, which is about the Civil War. Basically, East Anglia, which is the area to the south of Boston, Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex, that was loyal to Parliament completely throughout the war. Lincolnshire, the area, most of Lincolnshire kept changing hands. And so at some point, parliamentarians held various towns, and other towns were held by royalists, and they would capture one and then another. There was two towns next to each other called Spalding and Crowland, and Spalding was supportive of Parliament, and the other was and so they attacked each other. So there were some changes taking place there. Boston stayed loyal to Parliament, so it was safe from the south because that was parliamentary controlled territory, effectively. And so Boston sort of was not, the royalists were coming in and attacking various places within Lincolnshire. The nearest that we had an event in Lincolnshire was at the Earl of Manchester brought an army south towards Boston, and they knew he was coming. And as it happened, the royalist garrison that was in Boston at the time was commanded by Oliver Cromwell, and it was one of his first appointments. So he later becomes famous, but at this stage, it's very early part of his career. They know the Earl of Manchester is coming south from Horncastle, which is only about 15 miles north. So Cromwell takes his men and they advance north. So they meet at a village called Winceby, and the Battle of Winceby is one of the early battles, and Cromwell wins. And in fact, the place where the battle took place, God, this is the trouble of relying on memory. Yeah, the place where the battle took place is till this day is called Slash Hollow. So, you know, it's an indication that when you think, oh, there was a battle there, so that name Slash Hollow is still applied to us. That's about halfway between Boston and Horncastle. So that defeated the Royalists coming, and they never came any nearer to any future town. So Boston was always a bulwark. Places to the north, where some of them were held by the Royalists, anything 50. So the Royalists were within about 15, 16 miles of Boston to the north of the town. But Boston itself was loyally and completely, was never actually attacked. You know, that advance, the Battle of Windsor, that was the nearest that Royalists came to the town of Boston. Yeah.
So it was actually somewhat safe. So that destruction of church art inside St. Botolph's, what was that Eve is referring to?
I don't actually know. Sorry, I don't know that story. I'm awfully sorry. It's one I don't know the answer to. What I do know, which I can add to, is that so while Cromwell's men were actually there, they garrisoned their horses within the parish church, within St. Botolph's. And also, St. Botolph's had got a lot of basses that in the floor, which were commemorating people who died in the Middle Ages and on their tomb. And the parliamentarians thought this was brilliant, you know, because they could rip these brasses up, melt them, and make bullets out of them. So that's what happened. That's why there's a lot of slabs still surviving, but without any brass on the top of them.
Oh,
so that things, yeah.
So thinking again on that economic hub of Boston, England, and the migration to Boston, Massachusetts, with, you know, personal wealth, you were saying, coming to Boston, Massachusetts. Did Boston, Massachusetts send wealth back to Boston, England?
Don't think so, not particularly at that time. I think they were probably in a position where they needed to, you know, get to survive through the problems that they'd got, and they were certainly, you know, you hear records. I think Dudley at one point says, you know, he's writing. I think Dudley writing his diary. I think, and he says that he hasn't got a table or a desk to sit at. He was actually sitting next to the fire, writing his diary on his knee. So that would imply, you know, he was the man who had been the steward to the Earl of Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
You thought. Yeah. His wealth, he'd have at least either paid somebody to make him a desk or a table that he could work at. But so it seems that you know, they were needing to use their sort of, because they were still having to, of course, buy items that they needed back from England.
So that sense of wealth would have been more sort of a purchasing things.
They would use their wealth for the purchase of things that they needed in the colony, I think. Yeah.
In fact, there's a great story that John Morrison tells when we're doing our Boston 1630, Boston, Massachusetts 1630 tour, which is that John Winthrop, the leader, the non-Boston leader of the ships, actually used his own money to commission the ship. And now I'm, of course, forgetting the ship too. John Morrison might remember. But to commission the Lion to go straight back to England and bring back food for the fledgling colony, because Salem, which was founded before Boston, Massachusetts, was distinctly starving with that. Let's see. And the Rose, who took the photo, Rose Doherty took that last photo. Thank you, Rose, for getting us that photo. Was also commenting here, and now I'm trying to find where Rose is. There it is. She thanks you for your excellent presentation. Oh, she's agreeing with that statement about the 3 crowns on the seal being for Cologne or Cologne, that they were important trading partners.
They were, yes.
During the Middle Ages, there was a great deal of trading with Europe.
Oh, there was. It was, wool particularly went to Flanders, which is the Netherlands and Belgium and so on, that coastline. Others went to Italy and to France. And a lot of the imports were coming to us from the Baltic. So there was falcons and fur and Baltic timber and things like that.
So is North Sea especially facility? Here's geography again. So the North Sea and movement on the North Sea was important. By the 1600s, was there a lot of trade with Europe, or was Boston a bit?
Boston was reduced now to coastal trade because the foreign trade was going into places like London and South Coast towns, and of course some of the further field was going into Bristol as well on that side of the country. But Boston very much was just coastal trade very much by that period.
Yeah. And Rose is commenting that Boston, of course, was a member of the Hanseatic League, that North Sea, especially medieval trading league with that.
Just to qualify that, Boston, the league did actually have formal meetings at which people could agree procedures. Boston was not part of the league in that sense, but it was a trading town, and the league did have a warehouse and stuff. So it was a very important trading port with the league, but it wasn't a sort of a voting member of the league, as it were.
Oh, I see. Fascinating with that. So one question that you can answer briefly if you're able to, and then we're going to do a wrap up. Asking there was relative, as you pointed out, unity of theology and purpose in Boston, England. And why do you think, or do you think, that unity of theological purpose broke down quickly once they immigrated to Boston, Massachusetts? And the questioner admits that, yeah, this is actually part of a much bigger question of Puritanism in the New World.
Well, I think to use a classic phrase, that's a very interesting question, because what it means is the situation. When you're under pressure from the outside, you tend to keep together. And you might say, oh, well, we could disagree on a little theological point about this. But for outsiders, we've got to stay united, because if any one of us defects and says that something is wrong, that will be used by our enemies to attack us. So if you're under assault from outside, you tend to stick together as much as you can. You might, and within that, and probably keeping it a bit quiet so that the outsiders don't find out, you could discuss fine theological points. But then you're in a safe situation where in religious terms, there is nobody in New England criticizing, trying to destroy the Puritan group. Then you could say, wow, we don't need to conceal our real disagreements. We can let them come out. So I think there's a feeling when you're under protection, when you're under attack, you don't want to reveal to your enemy what your weaknesses are, or that you actually have disagreements within your group. But I think once you've got the freedom of being safe in that religious sense, then you can actually sort of start having your arguments. I think that's a fundamental reason for it. And again, that just spreads out to the whole situation of actually then expelling people, and so they have to go off and found new colonies, because so it actually illustrates an important part, I think, of human nature, that while you're under attack, you stay together. But once that outside pressure goes, bang, you just start to spread apart.
That's a fascinating way of ending it. So let's give a huge round of electronic and other applause to Neil for a really fascinating talk. And I want to end by just telling you what we're going to be up to in the fall, because this talk of Neil's really rounds up our sort of pre-fall, in some ways pre-New Year range of talks. In the autumn, or the fall as we call it here in New England, we will be, of course, doing our classic fall series, a series of related talks. And this year it is on tyrannies and liberties, political choices in 17th century New England. And as the presenter blurbs come in, we are posting them on the partnership website, and you can sign up for them. I believe by tomorrow evening, we will hopefully have 2 of the events up for you to sign up on, and we'll be continuing to flush it out as we get those partnership choices in. It is just about 3:30. I want to close by saying thank you, Neil. Thank you, everybody else. The Partnership of Historic Bostons is, as I said at the beginning, a small totally volunteer-run organization. We would love to get donations to keep us going because we do pay non-board presenters. We pay outside presenters. The board itself, we do everything voluntarily. And your donations, small and big and small, are always welcome. I've just posted the donate link. Also goes to our website. No, actually, that's straight to the PayPal. I'll put the website link in there too, if I can get to that very quickly. But we were just thrilled with all of this. There is the website. Let's get that over there too. And thank you, Neil. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, for ably doing all the tech stuff, which required a lot of scurrying and figuring out what you were doing. Thank you, world. This is great. Let's hear it for Boston's.